Welcome to Computer Science MS5, and in today's video we're going to be looking at the most fundamental concept in programming, which are variables, assignment operators, and inputs. So by the end of this video you should be able to explain what a variable is. You should be able to assign values to variables, and we're going to be able to allow a user to assign values to a variable using the input command. And finally, we're going to go through some examples so you can actually trace an algorithm and find out what the output's going to be. So we'll start off with a definition for what a variable is. Well, a variable is a location in memory that holds a value that can change while the program is running. Location in memory, it holds a value that can change while the program is running. So a variable is a location. It's a location. It's a named location that is found in memory. And when we're talking about memory, we're talking about RAM. And it can hold a value. It holds a value. So it holds a value inside that variable, which is a location in memory that can change while the program's running. So if we imagine our variable is a named location and it's named number, and it's holding the value 12, but our program's running, so that value could change to 23, it could change to 109, it could change to 19, change back to 109, change to 19. So a variable holds values that can change. Variables hold values that can change. So what could a value be? Well, a value could be a name, like Sebri. So if you think of when you sign up for Netflix, you have to enter your name. So that name is a location in memory, and it's going to hold a value that could change, which could be Sebri. It could be a number, like 2405, and you might have a calculator, and every time you enter that number into a calculator, it needs to be held in memory, so it's held in a variable. It could be a birthday. So when you signed up for Snapchat, you probably had to enter your birthday in. Could be a password. So whenever you enter your login details, your password is stored in a variable, so it can compare it to your email address and let you in. Or it could be the answer to a multiple choice question, which, it could be true or false. So the CPU stands for the central processing unit. Is that true or false? Your answer needs to be stored in a variable. Now, we've said variables hold values that can change, and as you'll notice, all of these values, Sebri 2405, 27th of June, P at RV33N, true, they're all values, and they can change because a name could be Maria, a number could be 12, your birthday could be the 13th of May, your password could be different, and your multiple choice answer could be false. So variables hold values that can change. A variable is a location in memory that holds a value that can change while the program is running. So all of these variables are named locations in memory. So we need to assign values to variables. So assigning means to give or allocate. So you must assign values to variables. You must give values to a variable. And in order to give a value to a variable, we use an equal sign. And that assigns a value to a variable. So if we take a variable, and the example of this variable could be age, and that is a named location in memory. So now we have a variable, which is a named location in memory, and it's going to hold a value. So we need to assign that value using an assignment operator, and that's our equal sign. That's called an assignment operator, and it allows us to give a value to a variable. So I'm going to be able to assign an age to my variable age, which is going to be a number. And the value, so 15, is assigned to the variable age. So inside the variable age now, if I took a look inside, I'd see the number 15. So let's look at another example. Let's say number. So number is now a location in memory, it's a variable, and I need to assign a value to it, and that value is going to be 1. So I'm assigning the number 1 to my variable number. So if I took a look inside number, it would be holding the value 1. Now let's look at another example. For example, birthday. So birthday is a named location in memory, and I want to assign a value to it, so I'm going to assign the 21st of August. So we have 3 parts to a variable assignment. We have the variable, which is a name. We have the assignment operator, which is an equal sign, and we have the value that we're assigning to the variable. So let's take a look at an example question and see if we can figure out what the variables are and assign some values to them. So write an algorithm that stores two numbers, adds them together, storing the result in a variable. So I've put stores two numbers. I'm abstracting, I'm focusing on these important details. And at the moment, the most important thing is that I can store two numbers. So in order to store two numbers, well, what two numbers could I store? Well, it hasn't specified what the numbers should be, just that I need to store two numbers. So they could be 20 and 50, for example. Now, these are values, and they must be stored in two variables because a variable holds a value, just one value that can change. So I need a variable to store 20, and I need a variable to store 50. So what names could I give those variables? Could I call it variable? Well, unfortunately not, because it's not meaningful enough. Could I call it number? Well, I'm going to have two numbers, so which number is going to go in number? So it's worth noting here that we have some rules for naming variables. And the first rule is that they need to be meaningful. If I'm storing a value inside a variable, I need to make it a meaningful name so I know what that value inside there is all about. It mustn't start with a number, can't have any spaces, and it can't be a reserved word like input. I'm going to go over this in a bit more detail later. So I'm going to use the variable name num1 and num2 because to me that's quite obvious. I'm storing the first number, I'm holding that first value in the variable num1, I'm holding the second value in the variable num2. So now I need to assign the values to the variables. Well, like we looked at before, I assign using the equal sign, so the value 20 is assigned to the variable num1, and the value 50 is assigned to the variable num2. So now I've answered that first part of the question, and probably gotten a mark or maybe 2 marks for it as well. So now let's look at the second part of the question, because we're writing an algorithm that stores two numbers. So we've stored two numbers in two variables, and now we need to add them together, storing the result in a variable. So let's add the variables together. Well, the values are 20 and 50, so should I just add 20 and 50 together? Well, if you said no, you'd be correct, because these are values that can change. So we need to add the variables together, because we could have stored the numbers 70 and 65 or 12 and 11. We could have stored different values because those values can change. So we're going to add the variables together, because when I add num1 plus num2, I'm adding whatever's inside those variables together. And of course, we need to store the result. So we'll need another variable. What could be a good name? What could be a good name to store the result of that calculation? Well, I did make it quite obvious. A good name would be results. And we need to assign the results of the calculation to the variable. So num1 plus num2, we're going to have an answer there. We need to assign it. So we're going to store the results in results. So now the sum of num1 plus num2 will be stored in results. And if we go back up, well, num1 is 20, num2 is 50. So 20 plus 50, the answer is going to be stored in results. Well, let's look at this all together. So we're writing an algorithm that stores two numbers, adds them together, storing the result in a variable. Well, we take our first variable, which is num1, and that is a location in memory. Remember, that variable is a location in memory. It's a named location, and the name of that location is now num1. We have our assignment operator, so we can assign the value 50. We have our second variable, num2. It is assigned a value, and that value is 20. And then we have our third variable, results, and it's being assigned the sum of num1 plus num2. Now, the question didn't ask us to output the result, but in order to trace and see how this program's working, I'd like you to try and think, what could the possible result be? What will be displayed on the screen if I print result? Well, it will be 70, because 50 is stored inside num1, 20 is held inside num2. So here, where it says num1 plus num2, I'm actually doing 50 plus 20. That's being assigned to result. And 50 plus 20 is 70. So if I display what's inside result, the answer will be 70. So let's look at the same question, but we're going to change it just a little bit. So we're going to write an algorithm that stores two numbers entered by a user, adds them together, storing the result in a variable. Well, previously we just assigned the numbers 50 and 20, but here we want to give the option to the user, the person using the program, to enter those numbers. So enter means input. If you see the word enter, it means input. And an input allows the user to enter data into a program. A user input assigns data to a variable entered by the user. A user input assigns data to a variable entered by the user. So how do we do that? Well, we have a variable like before, a named location in memory. We have an assignment operator because we need to assign a value. But this is when it changes slightly. And we have a command, and this is an input command. And that means we're going to allow the user to enter data. And we have a prompt. So instead of assigning a value to num1, I'm actually asking the user to enter a number. That's prompting the user to enter a number. We don't know what number the user is going to enter because that's going to be a value that could change. So let's take a look at what that would be like. Well, we have our first number, num1, an assignment operator. We have our input, and we have our prompt. So the user can enter a number, and that will be stored inside the variable num1. Well, we again have a second variable, num2, to store the second number the user is going to enter. They're going to have an input command, and our prompt's going to be a little bit different, just to say enter another number. And finally, the user will input the values. These numbers could be anything, they can change, which is why they are stored in variables. So the user inputs could change. One user might enter 15 and 12, another user might enter 56 and 100. So we don't know what they're going to enter. That's why we have the input command, because it will allow them to enter a number, and that will be stored in num1 and num2. Finally, we have the result. And we are going to add num1 and num2 and display the result. So let's take a look at an example. What will be output? What will be printed if the user inputs 3 and 23? So these are separate scenarios, and we're going to trace the algorithm here. So if the user enters 3, if the user inputs 3, well, there's the user's input, it's 3. And that is now stored inside num1. So we're just tracing, we're following the user's inputs. Then the user inputs 23, and that's going to be stored inside num2. Oh, well, now if we go num1 plus num2, well, num1 is 3, num2 is 23. So what will the answer be? Well, it should be 26, because 3 plus 23 is 26, and result will store that, and that will be displayed. So just pause the video here, run through the same exercise with the numbers 12 and 55. Okay, so if you round them through, you should have gotten 67 and 8 as the outputs to the next two inputs. So we're going to take a look at one more example, and it's going to be about how we identify the variables and inputs in an exam question. How we identify the variables and inputs in an exam question. So we need to write an algorithm that asks the user to enter their surname and then their first name. The program then outputs the user's first name and then their surname separately. Well, the first keyword we've got there, or key phrase, is ask the user to enter. Ask is a keyword that tells us we will need an input and variable to hold the value. So if we're asking the user for something, the user is going to enter or input something. And if the user is going to input or enter a value, we need somewhere to store that value. Well, we're asking them to enter their surname. So that's the first value they're going to enter. We're also asking them to enter their first name. So that's going to be the second value they need to enter. So we need to put down some variable names. Well, surname, and how about first name? And if you think back to the rules that we had about variables, we couldn't have any spaces, so I've used what's called camel caps here. And these are really clear, meaningful variable names. And what do we do next? Well, we have an assignment operator, we have the input command, and we have a prompt telling the user to enter their surname. We have an assignment operator, we have the input command, and again, we have a prompt telling the user to enter their first name. And the second part of the question asks them to output the user's first name and surname separately, and that will output their surname and their first name. In this example, I haven't used any data, but you could imagine the user might enter the name Muhammad, and they might enter the surname Ali, in which case it will print Muhammad and Ali. So this is our last example where we're going to identify the variables and inputs in an exam question. So here we've asked to write an algorithm that prompts the user for the distance in meters. It asks the user for the time in seconds that a journey was completed in. Calculates and outputs the average speed. Well, prompts the user. Well, prompts again is another keyword like asks that tells a user we will need an input and a variable to hold the value. We're asking the user for the distance in meters, so that's going to be our first variable. We're also going to ask the user for the time, so that's going to be another variable because that's a value the user is going to be entering. And we're going to need a variable to hold the average speed because that's going to be a result of the calculation that we need to store. So we have the variable distance, we have the variable time. Now we need to assign a user input to them. So we have an assignment operator, the input command, and a prompt, enter distance in meters. And again, we have an assignment operator, the input command, and a prompt, which is going to be enter time in seconds. And finally, we're going to have a calculation which we're assigning to the average speed variable, where it's distance divided by time. And we're going to display the average speed. Well, try and trace through this algorithm and see what would be output. So 50 would be assigned to the distance variable, 10 would be assigned to the time variable. 50 divided by 10 should equal 5. So the average speed for that distance traveled was 5. Well, thanks for listening. I hope at the end of this video you should be able to explain what a variable is. It's a named location in memory that can hold a value that can change. You should be able to assign variables. You should be able to assign values to variables using assignment operators. And you should be able to allow a user to assign a value to a variable using the input command. And finally, you should be able to trace